the evil terrorists. Terrorists, 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 terrorists,
Terrorist, 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 terrorist.
Terrorist.
terrorists,
Terrorist, terrorist.
terrorists, 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 terrorists.
Defining terrorism is not an easy thing to do, as is evidenced by the fact that the Routledge Handbook of Terrorism research has more than 250 definitions of it. Peter Waldman posited a tentative intimation of the characteristics of a terrorist organization as perpetrators of acts of violence against a political order, acts distinguished by their arbitrariness and brutality, intended to arouse fear but also create sympathy and willingness to support the terrorist's goals. Further, that terrorist groups are not usually strong enough to control territory or openly challenge a regime. Rather, they are provocative and challenge superior foes by making surprise attacks and violating norms. The weaker party's aims are to provoke the stronger to resort to violence and self-defense, hoping thereby to convince the public that the state is brutal and unjust, and the attacker is the real victim of injustice. However, Richard Jackson questioned the assumption that terrorism can be objectively defined and studied. He argued that terrorism is a social fact rather than a brute fact, and it is constructed through speech acts by socially authorized speakers, meaning that terrorism is constructed by and through an identifiable set of discursive practices, such as the categorization and collection of data by academics and security officials, and the codification of certain actions in law. Whereas for Ferrell and Hayward, cultural criminologists argue that seemingly natural or objective phenomena are in reality neither natural nor objective. Rather, they are cultural constructions, they are phenomena constructed in particular ways by those with the influence or power to do so. Political institutions decide which acts are to be made legal or illegal. Media institutions portray particular crimes in such a way as to spawn more or less fear of them. The term terrorism was originally used in the French Revolution to describe the violent repression of those opposed to the revolution. Since then, the term has been used to cover a far wider range of actions, from dictatorial oppression and shock and awe rapid dominance tactics to guerrilla warfare-style insurgent resistance, political actions by groups like the Baader-Meinhof group, and of course religious forms of terrorism, the likes of which are permanently in the news. Religious terrorism is often equated with Islam, but it originated in the 1600s with the Guy Fawkes dissident Catholic plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament. Since then, the three iterations of the Ku Klux Klan have engaged in racial and religious terrorist acts. The Phineas priesthood and Anders Breivik are other examples of self-identified Christians that became terrorists. Peter Waldman created a typology of motivation for terrorist organizations. Using organizations' definitions of themselves, he found that terrorist organizations could be counted as either social revolutionary, ethno-nationalist, or religious, though of course there is significant overlap between categories, and many organizations have multiple agendas and sectors. Jihadism has become synonymous with religious terrorism, but as Malise Ruthven notes, the term simply means struggle, which can be interpreted as meaning an internal struggle, a struggle with the heart, tongue, hand, or sword. Jihadism is an action engaged in by marginalized people who reject Occidental moral permissiveness and radical individualization. It is a retreat to traditional values in a desire to recreate the Ummah under Sharia law. It can be seen as a backward-looking, utopian vision of an impossible future. To better understand this phenomenon, I will look in more detail at Hezbollah. Hezbollah are a good example of the complexity of defining organizations. Their name means Party of God. They are a Shiite Muslim organization in Lebanon, and they hold seats in the Lebanese parliament, though they also have a military wing, which is classified as a religious terrorist organization by the EU and US. However, in many parts of the Arab world, Hezbollah are seen as a resistance movement with political legitimacy. The main aims of Hezbollah military wing are to establish a Shiite theocracy in Lebanon, eliminate the Zionist Israeli state, and vanquish Occidental imperial influences in the region through Shia jihadism. They have been heavily connected with the Islamic Jihad organization, a group shrouded in mystery, an organization that seemed to exist mainly to distance Hezbollah from some of its more unsavory actions. While he was not talking about Hezbollah, Jeffrey Sluker's analysis is applicable to their military wing. He said, "The jihadist subculture not only provides a potent vocabulary for expressing outright contempt for Western values, values that humiliatingly scorn and mock the jihadist, since they cannot live up to them, it also confers a heroic status upon its members and legitimates violent revenge against the sources of their frustration. Moreover, it provides them with a powerful sense of identity and an unambiguous and infallible guide for negotiating their lives in the face of the vertiginous array of choices and possibilities and temptations that advanced Western societies have to offer. Seen in this light, the roots of jihadism lie not in Islam, but in how Muslim men respond to personal feelings of failure over who or what they are. This does not mean that the ideology of violent Islam is causally unimportant. On the contrary, it provides the justifying and exculpatory narratives that enable jihadists to overcome civilized moral constraints." At its inception, Hezbollah was a self-professed religious organization inspired by the Iranian Revolution. It did not arise in a vacuum, however. Lebanon had been under French colonial occupation from 1920 up until 1943, and later had played host to many Palestinian refugees, whose homeland was being illegally occupied by the US and UK-sponsored State of Israel. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, along with Shiite Lebanese Muslims, engaged in violent confrontation with Israel in the south of Lebanon, and Hezbollah formed out of the ensuing chaos with the support of Iran. Hezbollah recruited Shiite Muslims by appealing to their religion, as they were marginalized and alienated by all other factions within Lebanon at the time. In this context, Hezbollah's appeal for an alienated group who had lived through colonialism, a group who had seen the systematic extermination of their fellow Muslims across the border in Palestine at the hands of a Western imperialist Zionist regime, would have been found in the potential for a sense of belonging found in a group offering a solidaristic environment that promoted Islam and promised glory to those who resisted Western encroachment in what they saw as Arabic lands.
هذا الموقف المبدئي كمان إذا أخذنا التطورات معه، أولا لأنه أمريكا بنظرنا هي أم الإرهاب، واللي بده يناقش تفضل نناقش. هي أصل الإرهاب في هذا العالم. إذا في إرهاب في هذا العالم فتشوا على الإدارة الأمريكية، طبعا نحكي عن الشعب الأمريكي. اثنين، لأن أمريكا هي الداعم المطلق لدولة الإرهاب الصهيونية. أصل الإرهاب بمنطقتنا سبب وجود دولة إسرائيل التي تحظى بدعم مطلق أمريكي، عسكري وأمني وسياسي واقتصادي ومالي وقانوني، حتى فيتو، حتى إدانة ممنوعة بمجلس الأمن إذا الموضوع عليها بإسرائيل. ثالثا، أمريكا صنعت أو شاركت في صنع هذه التيارات الإرهابية التكفيرية وهذه الجماعات الإرهابية. رابعا، أمريكا ليست في موقع أخلاقي يؤهلها قيادة تحالف للحرب على الإرهاب أصلا، ولا يوم من الأيام. هي كانت في موقع أخلاقي، يعني اللي عامل اللي ضارب قنابل ذرية على الناس باليابان، اللي عامل حروب يندى لها الجبين، اللي كل هذا التاريخ له، اللي لقبل كم يوم كان يقف إلى جانب نتنياهو في حرب 50 يوما على قطاع غزة وعلى أهل غزة، يقصف ويدمر ويقتل الآلاف ويجرح الآلاف ويهجر عشرات الآلاف من منازلهم. هاي الإدارة الأمريكية هي غير مؤهلة أخلاقيا لتقدم نفسها على أنها محارب للإرهاب أو على أنها قائد لتحالف دولي يستهدف الإرهاب.